London was swinging and with it to welcome the 70s. It's been said that the new year is a time for the young and that the 70s will be their era. If they all insist on taking a freezing bath, there won't be many of them around to enjoy it.
All right. Are you ready, Ringo?
Ready, George.
1, 2, 3, 4.
On the 3rd and 4th of January 1970, Paul, George and Ringo gathered together in EMI Studio 2 at Abbey Road for what would be their last recording session together until their reunion in 1994. The last time all four Beatles had been together in the same studio had been back in August the previous year, putting the finishing touches to Abbey Road. In September, John had declared he wanted a divorce from the Beatles, which effectively ended their recording career together, but as the new decade dawned, three of them found themselves back at Abbey Road, tidying up the one-year-old sessions for the forthcoming release of the Let It Be album. Despite all the business, musical and relationship issues, the trio had just seen in the new year together with their wives at Ringo and Maureen's party in Highgate, North London. The first day was spent professionally recording I, Me, Mine, all new with no elements used from the previous year's rehearsals at Twickenham. In fact, nothing had been professionally recorded at Twickenham, and I, Me, Mine was never played through at Savile Row. As the footage of John and Yoko waltzing to a demo of George's new song was to be used in the forthcoming movie, there was a need to record the song in full for what was conceived as a soundtrack album.
As far as the Beatles go, we've got the Let It Be album, which should be out in about 3 or 4 weeks. It's been held up really because the best way to do it was to put out the film. We're trying to put the film out in about 40 different cities throughout the world, all at once.
The trio started recording at 2:30 p.m, with George on acoustic, Paul on bass, and Ringo on drums. After take 10, Paul exclaimed, "One more." But take 11 would not actually start until the boys went through a rendition of the Everly Brothers' Wake Up, Little Susie.
Wake up, Susie, wake up. One, 2, 3, 4.
After take 11 is performed, Paul states, "I think I can do one better than that." Before take 12 begins, George leads them through Buddy Holly's Peggy Sue Got Married, as well as a brief reprise of the original flamenco section of I, Me, Mine, which he had earlier discarded. An electric piano, a second acoustic, an electric guitar with lead and backing vocals were then overdubbed onto the final take. In April, Phil Spector would double the length of the track and add 18 violins, 4 violas, 3 trumpets, 3 trombones, 14 vocalists, a harp, and a choir. Interestingly, photos from this day show George playing John's Epiphone Casino guitar in his absence, this quite possibly being the electric guitar used on this very recording. Always efficient as a trio, the sessions were wrapped up after 16 takes, just after midnight. And, as mentioned, there was one very important band member missing.
You all will have read that
Dave D's no longer with us, but Mickey and Titch and I just like to carry on the good work that's always gone down in number 2.
Dave D, Dozy, Beaky, Mick and Titch were an English pop group who had a string of top 10 hits in the latter half of the 1960s. The comparison of John to Dave D was quite apt in some ways. Dave D was also the founder member and had left his own group, like John, in September 1969 to pursue a solo career. In January, John and Yoko were in Denmark visiting Yoko's daughter Kyoko, who was living with her ex-husband Tony Cox. The second and last day of the Beatles' only 1970 sessions was on the 4th of January, and it was fitting that George Martin was with them for one last time. The final day was reserved for overdubs on Let It Be. George Martin had been commissioned to write a score for brass and cello overdubs for Let It Be, hiring 8 studio musicians for the day, including 2 trumpets, 2 trombones, and a tenor saxophone. Despite the original Get Back project intended to show the Beatles recorded live, warts and all, they had no qualms in reverting to the use of overdubs to finally complete the album. Using the original 8-track recording from a year earlier, Paul, George and Linda McCartney laid down harmony vocals. Then came a distorted guitar solo from George, unused for the single release, followed by additional drums from Ringo, maracas from Paul, and a cello at the very end. Paul also replaced John's sketchy bass part from the original recording, the result being that John does not appear on either the single or album version of Let It Be. At 4 a.m, the session ended. 10 days later, Ringo resumed work started in October on what would be the first studio album from a solo Beatle, if you discount John and George's earlier experimental outings. John had already released a live piece in Toronto, and 3 weeks later, John was in Studio 3 laying down Instant Karma together with George. At George's suggestion, Phil Spector produced this session, which ultimately led to him being appointed as a reproducer for the Let It Be album. Meanwhile, Paul was quietly continuing to work on his own studio album, McCartney. He laid down the first track, The Lovely Linda, at home just before Christmas. And that was how the Beatles greeted the start of the 1970s, with the final recording as a trio until 24 years later, when Paul, George and Ringo reunited to start work on 3 John Lennon demos.